So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Fox. Welcome to our second quarter of Beyond the Noise. The topic for today is exploring tariffs in a global age. Perhaps you've heard about a little bit about this term called tariffs in the news lately. Some of our discussion points for today will be what are tariffs and what are six kinds of tariffs? We'll look into the history of tariffs and free trade. From there, we'll discuss why countries use tariffs. And finally, what are Trump's likely goals with tariff and potential impacts? Our panelists will speak for about 30 minutes, and we'll have time for questions after that. As usual, our chat feature is not available due to compliance reasons, but if you'd like to send a question or ask a question, if you could send that question to my email address, bill@thefoxalliance.com. Our presenters today will be Max Clark, Laura Cooper, and Josh Renfro. Max will be our first presenter. Max, please take it away.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. As Bill mentioned, I think a good place for us to start would be getting a better understanding of what tariffs are and what the various types of tariffs possibilities are. So let's start off by just talking about kind of the basic tariff that Trump has been utilizing a lot in his tariff policy that's been implemented. And that's what we would refer to as an ad valorem tariff. So the simple definition of that is a tax based on a fixed percentage of the value of the imported good. So we've heard a lot about this, right? For example, a 10% ad valorem tariff on imported wine means that if a bottle costs $20, the tariff is $2. Very simple percentage on top of the imported good. The next option would be similar, but instead of a percentage, it's a fixed fee per physical unit, and that's what's referred to as a specific tariff. So, for example, a tariff of $1.50 per pair of imported shoes means the importer pays $1.50 per unit, whether the shoes cost $10 or $100. So, a little different approach for kind of the same objective. And then the next option would be a compound tariff. So there are situations where you might see a combination of both an ad valorem tariff and a specific tariff on the same product, and that's what a compound tariff is. So let's take a look at an example on luxury watches. That might include a 5% ad valorem tariff plus $10 per watch. So if the watch costs $1,000, that 5% is $50. You add another $10 on top of that, and we're looking at a $60 tariff all in. Let's move on to the next option. This is kind of a description of a tariff feature that might be incorporated into trade agreements. So this is what's referred to as a preferential tariff. So it's a reduced or zero tariff rate offered to goods imported from certain countries under trade agreements. So basically, while other countries, our policy might be as the U.S., hey, everything imported related to automotive parts might be a 15, 20% tariff. Under this certain trade agreements, we might reduce that for preferential countries. So, for example, under the USMCA, U.S. imports of Canadian automotive parts may face no tariff, while the same part from a non-member country may face a 10% tariff. And obviously now the increase is more significant than that, given the recent adjustments. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The next option would be something referred to as a bound tariff. You see this under like World Trade Organization rules and kind of our global free trade agreements, where you've got a maximum tariff rate a country has committed to under those rules. And it can't raise tariffs above those levels without negotiating with the other countries. So, for example, the U.S. has a bound tariff of, say, 2.5% on imported cars. And it can apply a lower rate, but not exceed 2.5% unless it negotiates with trading partners. So that's what's referred to as a bound tariff. The last one isn't really a tariff, but it is a very effective way to also add in place import protections or trade protections, and that's import quotas. So essentially just a limit on the quantity of a specific good that can be imported into a country during a given period. For example, maybe we allow only 1.2 million tons of sugar to be imported tariff-free each year, and any amount above that is either restricted or it's heavily taxed. You know, you'd see tariffs, say, ad valorem or specific tariffs added on top of that. So all of these are different tools that any country can use to influence trade with other countries and help or hurt their citizens and our industries. So when we take a look at a few other components of tariffs and things to be aware of when we're just learning about tariffs and how they're implemented, the policy specifically is set by the U.S. Trade Representative, and that's also in conjunction with the Department of Commerce and more specifically, or more importantly, the President as well. That's ultimately enforced, though, by U.S. Customs and Border Protection. They're the ones who are actually taking payment, generally speaking, for the tariffs as those goods are imported. It's also important to note that the tariffs are not just assessed on finished goods, but they're also assessed on components. So if you're, say, manufacturing a vehicle in Detroit or in Canada, it's very possible that you've got components that are crossing over the border there with the United States and Canada multiple times. And every time that crosses over, it's very possible that you're getting tariffs added to that. So there's a possibility that while the actual car might only get experience a tariff if it was manufactured in Canada and imported to the US once, the components that go into that car might have been tariffed multiple times as well. So something to keep in mind as you think about the impacts of tariffs. The last thing to note here would be that it's a common misconception that tariffs are paid by the exporter. So, if we're importing something from China, hey, the people in China are going to be paying that tariff. That's not the case. The tariff is actually paid by the importer. So when it is received into the port here in the United States, it is not released from the port to the importer until they pay that tariff. And there's a couple of ways around that where you can get bonds and those sorts of things to kind of give you a few weeks to pay that tariff, but they won't release it until the tariff has been paid. One other thing to note about this that I think is really important for us to understand as we think through tariff policy is that the tariff is applied to the price at which it is imported. So oftentimes that import price is the lowest price that we're going to see. It's wholesale of the wholesale. And you'll see a markup then to the wholesaler, and then a markup then to the retailer, and then a markup then to the retail customer. So in many instances where we might see, say, a 10% tariff on imported clothes or imported shoes, that might be 10% on, say, $10, but it ends up getting sold at $50. So a $1 tariff on the $10 import, when you put that over a $50 shoe, it's more like a 2 or 3% tariff, far less of an impact than what we're looking at here. So something to keep in mind there as well when we're talking about retail goods in particular, the import price is often far lower, and you don't end up seeing, in many instances, a direct, hey, it's a 10% tariff, so we're going to see a direct 10% increase on the price that's ultimately paid by the retail customer. So with that in mind, let's talk about kind of a positive side of tariffs and a negative side of tariffs that's we've been thinking about on our end. So on the positive side, by their very nature, tariffs are what we would describe as a consumption tax, meaning you pay tax at the time that good is consumed. Now, if we were to look at kind of the various ways that a country can tax its citizens, there are kind of three main types. One would be consumption tax. Another would be property taxes, like what we pay here in Texas on our homes. We pay property tax each year. It's basically tax that we pay on the value of something that we own every year. And then the third would be income taxes. And obviously that's where you're paying tax as you earn the income. And if we were to rank all of those, our first preference would be consumption tax, because that's the thing that we feel least bad about hindering or putting a tax on. We really want to promote people owning property. We really want to promote people earning income. And then, you can kind of choose what you buy and when you buy it, and therefore you can influence how much tax you're going to pay along the way. So in that respect, tariffs are a consumption tax. That's a positive thing in our book. Now, on the flip side, one of the negatives, and probably the key negative that many people talk about with tariffs is that tariffs are effectively a tax on the lowest cost good globally. So why are people importing things from China? Why are they importing things from Indonesia? They're doing that because that's the cheapest place that they can get it. And if we're adding a tariff onto those lowest cost goods globally, that means citizens of the country imposing the tariffs end up paying more. So while it is a consumption tax, positive thing, we are um, influencing the kind of free markets by effectively taxing the lowest price good, therefore increasing inflation. Now, with that kind of as the backdrop, let's set the stage for our conversation today about current tariff policy by taking a look at the journey that we've come on to free trade today. And many people would classify as where we are today, the modern era of free trade. So let's go back a little over 100 years ago to when President William McKinley was in office. And we could describe kind of the late 1800s as protectionism. We had very high tariffs. Specifically, William McKinley, with the McKinley Tariff Act, imposed very high protective tariffs or duties on imports. And you that's kind of the stage that we had going into World War I and World War II. And World War II in particular, post World War II, really saw the shift or the transition to free trade begin. And that was primarily because the US was really the only economic superpower in the world that had not been effectively destroyed by the war. The war was largely fought in Europe and in Asia, and we had very little impact here in North America. And therefore, we were in a position to produce a lot of goods and have the international community buy it. So we really thought that it would make sense for us to help them rebuild and also for us to sell our goods to encourage global trade liberalization. And so coming out of that, we ended up, you can see this in the upper right-hand corner of the timeline here, the GATT, which was the Global Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, or Tariffs and Trade. And essentially what that did was it lowered tariffs globally, and in particularly lowered tariffs from the United States side of things, allowing us to more effectively export our goods to the others, and obviously import goods as well from the other countries. And obviously we saw tariffs lowered across Europe and elsewhere as well, so that we could export our goods to them. So that kind of set the stage as we were transitioning to this free trade world. And in the late mid 90s, really, we saw NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, in 1994, and then the World Trade Organization in 1995, which is what many would describe as the foundations for current free trade. Now, in order to be intellectually honest about everything, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that what we describe as free trade today may not be what many people imagine free trade to actually be. When I think of free trade, and when I grew up thinking of free trade, my thought process was, hey, we're making trades with other people. It's totally free. We're not imposing tariffs or anything like that. When in reality, there are some aspects of trade today that are not actually free. So let me give you a couple of examples. One, obviously, we've got tariffs that are imposed. Other countries do have tariffs imposed, but that's not the key thing that we would want to point out. There are two others. One would be we have the protection of the rule of law here in the United States. And so our companies here in the United States are having to operate according to the rule of law, and we're subject to regulations and all sorts of things. Whereas a company in, say, China may not have those same regulations, and they have a very different rule book by which they can play. You might also find us, if our companies are trying to operate in China, they are the companies there that are competing with them are have much more liberal opportunities to take advantage of our companies that are operating there. And it creates an interesting dynamic where Chinese companies that want to operate here in the US, great, they're protected, they've got all of these wonderful legal protections here in the United States and can come and compete with our companies effectively. We go over there, and what are they doing? They're operating with a very different rule book. And that really kind of leads to the second factor is where we're seeing our countries or our companies get kind of pilfered, particularly in China, by theft of intellectual property and those sorts of things, which China doesn't just allow from its companies, it encourages. And so while we're in a position where we would describe this as free trade, it's certainly a lot freer than it was back in the late 1800s. We're in a different world right now where we're experiencing some aspects of trade that aren't just tariff related, they are more rule of law, legal focused, which I think as we go through these negotiations, hopefully that's something that gets addressed. But obviously, if we're looking back historically, we have had a historic, call it for the last 50, 60, 70 years, a period where we've been a lot freer than we have in the past. Tariffs have been low, and people have been able to import to the US very easily. And we've obviously been able to export as well. So use that as the backdrop as we go into our discussions about today. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Laura, who's going to talk a little bit more about kind of what the purpose is for tariffs and also discuss the concepts of, what the policy is right now. So Laura, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Max. All right. Well, as Max mentioned, I'm going to start off with discussing some of the purposes of tariffs and why a country might choose to implement them. So, starting with the first, protecting consumers. Tariffs can really help to regulate the quality of products coming into a country, as well as keep harmful products out. So, to give an example, let's say there's a pharmaceutical manufacturing company and they are importing their raw materials. Obviously, in pharmaceutical manufacturing, it's important to make sure that the quality of those raw materials are the highest they can be. And so there might be a tariff placed on raw materials that do not meet a certain testing standard or a certain purity standard that are not pharmaceutical grade. So that's just an example. Second purpose here is to protect infant industries. So as Max mentioned, the McKinley Tariff Act did a phenomenal job at actually being able to protect infant industrial companies in the US and allow for them to grow, become competitive on a global stage, and actually boost the American economy. So when tariffs are implemented and kind of keeps out those global giants and allows those industries to grow and become competitive in the long run, creating a level playing field. And this really pertains to the different practices or rules and regulations regarding U.S. companies establishing themselves in other countries and vice versa. So first, China as an example. For a U.S. company to establish themselves in China, the barriers are much different than for a Chinese company to establish themselves in the U.S. So tariffs can be used as a tool to help level the playing field there. The fourth reason is in terms of national security. So this is really important for industries like defense, infrastructure, and energy. Obviously, those industries are really sensitive and oftentimes confidential in nature. You want to keep those industries in-house, if you will, and kind of domesticate that industry. And the last is as a form of retaliation. So, let's say there's a country that violates trade agreements or engages in unfair trade practices. Tariffs can often be used as a form of retaliation for those violation of those trade practices. One of the things that we think it's really important to note is when it comes to tariffs to beware of special interest. When you start to get really surgical with tariffs, and oftentimes you have to, it can create an opportunity where carve-outs and specific products get unfair treatment, whether either they are benefited from those tariff practices. And so we think that it's important to make sure that you beware of the special interest. The purpose of the tariff is not to benefit one specific industry or one specific product. It's to incentivize the economy of the country within. So we think that's important to note. The last thing that I will mention here is the recent policy. And these numbers here are from Liberation Day. So obviously, some of these numbers have changed. We are getting information and news every single day. So I'll touch on what we know and then kind of what is changing. So there's a 10% universal tariff on all US imports with some exclusions. If we look at some of our trade partners here, China at 145%, this is the one that is probably the most notable. It has been delayed for 90 days. So we'll see how that actually turns out in the long run if there's a trade agreement that's able to be met, but that is the current policy that's been announced. 27% with India, 20% with the EU, and then 17 to 50% with various other trade partners. The one area that I think is really important to note here is the steel and aluminum and auto industry tariff. When it was announced on Liberation Day, that tariff was set at 25%. It was announced later that it would be increased to 50%, and that is expected to go into effect starting tomorrow. So we'll see if that actually happens and what the end result of that will be. But again, this is the current policy that we're under. It's very different than the policy that we've been under for the last 4 years or so. And with that, I will turn it over to Josh to discuss the implications.
Thanks, Laura. Max, could you turn on the ability for my video to come on? Thank you very much. Okay. So I wanted to talk about, I think it's really important. So we've kind of laid the groundwork here with exactly what are the different kinds of tariffs that can be used and what has so far been thrown out there. But at the end of the day, the important thing to understand is that there is nothing that is set as of yet. We're in a situation where what the actual intention of Trump is very unclear. And so, from our standpoint, we feel like it's helpful to set up what we believe are the three likely strategic goals that Trump could ultimately have. And we would define those into three categories here. The first is, and I want you to envision for a moment maybe your favorite mob boss movie. And there's a couple of mob bosses in the room, and suddenly you've got President Trump come in with an AR-15, and one of three scenarios unfolds. The first of which is he comes into the room, he doesn't actually intend to shoot. He's holding the gun, but he's largely hoping to use it as a negotiating tool. He doesn't want to shoot. Second option is he absolutely intends to shoot, but he intends to shoot one or two strategic people and largely leave most other people unharmed. The last option, though, is that his intention is, as he comes into the room, is to unload the entire clip. All 30 rounds are going to go in, and there's no one going to be left unhit at the end of the day. So, what do we mean by each of those three? The first option is the least negative, because at the end of the day, if Trump really is largely trying to negotiate on a lot of actual things that are not tariff related ultimately, then it will cause, in our opinion, a good amount of volatility. And it's likely that the markets will experience heavy volatility on both the positive and negative side as we go through that. But at the end of the day, we'll come out on the other side, likely with some scratches and bruises, but probably no real serious injuries. The second option, which once again is the option where his intention actually is to shoot a few people strategically, is the most uncertain of the three, because so much of the ultimate outcome depends on precisely what are the negotiations and what he's ultimately able to achieve in that process. And the longer that negotiation lasts, the more volatile and crazy the market can ultimately end up getting. The final option is actually quite certain in terms of what the results are, but in my opinion would be by far the most negative. And really, to have this view, the view that basically Trump's intention is to come into the room and unload the clip, to shoot everybody in the room, effectively means what Trump is really a proponent of actually here is a policy where tariffs are actually a very large portion of the income that the US government generates from taxes. Now, the other thing I think that's important to understand is what does the market actually think is the most likely outcome right now? Because what the market thinks determines how the market ultimately moves. Now, on Liberation Day, the stock market began to crater. And the reason it began to crater was because the markets believed that option number three, which they had thought up to that point wasn't really a very likely option, was suddenly the most likely option in the room. As Trump has put pauses, 90-day pauses on most of the tariffs, that has made people's views shift from number three being the most likely option to number two being the most likely option. And so that's what you've seen priced into the market. As the stock market has moved back up, it is a reflection of the fact that individual and institutional investors in the market believe that what Trump is trying to do is to make things, quote, more fair between certain specific partners and in certain specific industries. But his intention is not to generate 500 to say $800 billion of tariffs, which is what the tariffs that he imposed on Liberation Day effectively would have done, assuming that trade remained the same, which obviously it would not have at that particular point in time. So I want to talk through some of the specific impacts of this. And actually, before we go there, I do want to touch on one thing, which I think is a crucial point. I'm personally not a fan of large scale tariffs. I think that in general, it's likely to cause inflation, and I think there's a better chance that special interests win the day and certain U.S. industries don't have to be as competitive. That's my general opinion. Having said that, I do have some substantial sympathy for specifically certain industries that are really crucial to the United States. I'll give you just two examples. One of those are rare earth minerals. There are certain rare earth minerals that are used in semiconductors and a large portion of other very strategic national defense or what I would consider very crucial infrastructure. Right now, because China is the low-cost producer, they refine 90% of those rare earth minerals. At any point in time, if they decided to stop refining those rare earth minerals and sending them to the US, we would be in a lot of trouble. I think that's a good example of an industry where it would make a lot of sense to allow for the creation of our own industry and to protect it via tariffs in order to make sure that we could have access to that even in the midst of a time of war. Another good example of that would be steel and aluminum, as an example, all crucial manufacturing that's in materials that are needed on that side of things. So I think it's an important point that needs to be thought of as we're going through this entire process. But a couple of just general takeaways I think that's important to remember. The world order for the last century has been to largely operate in a free trade environment. If option two or three, which at this point we believe are the most likely options, are what's going to end up taking place, transition is going to be painful. Let me just give you an example. We, several members of our investment committee, were having a meeting with one of the portfolio managers we were considering in the small company space. And she was talking about how one of the portfolio companies that she was doing due diligence on described a predicament that they're facing right now, which is right now, a lot of their goods are ultimately are actually manufactured in China before they ultimately get distributed over here to the US. And they're in a real predicament because the problem is they can't be competitive with the tariff increase that's happened. Now, no one expects the 145% to actually stay. Some sort of negotiation will take place, and the number will likely be much smaller. But even with a much smaller number, it will likely make them far less competitive or even completely uncompetitive in the industry that they have been functioning in for a long time. The problem is this: for them to ultimately transition their manufacturing, according to them, it would take 2 years and about $100 million to relocate that manufacturing. And the problem is, guess what? Trump's term is only expected to last for another 3 years. And because these tariffs have been administered through executive action, you could have the next administration come in and completely reverse everything. And suddenly you spent the $100 million and 2 years relocating for no reason at all. So that's just one small example, but there will be large amounts of companies all over the world that are caught up in a similar kind of dynamic because of what's going on right now. The second thing, which is closely tied to it, is supply chains will be massively disrupted due to what's going on right now. We saw supply chains get hit really hard in the midst of COVID. And I think that there's a good chance that this could be probably not as disruptive, but still at a similar level of magnitude to what we saw in COVID, depending upon what the ultimate end tariffs actually are at the end of the day. And so that's another thing that we need to keep in mind. We saw part of the reason, not the only reason, but part of the reason we saw inflation as bad as we did in 21 and 22 was because of supply chain disruptions. Now, it was also because we injected $4.5 trillion into the US economy from the Federal Reserve and also through stimulus through the government. But supply chain breakdown absolutely was also a contributing factor to that side of things as well. And so the last two impacts. We think that this will likely have a very substantial acceleration when it comes to more regionalism. For the longest time, the US has been the central power in the world, and everything revolved around the United States. Effectively, what Trump has already signaled, and it's something that was already starting, but it's being accelerated, is the US is withdrawing. Instead of us being the national or the international police, um, we're largely more concerned about the Western Hemisphere. We're less concerned about the Eastern Hemisphere. Not that we still don't have strategic interests, but we do. But that shift into more of a bipolar world is growing more and more, with other powers taking more central roles, such as China, as an example, or Russia on that side. So we're going from a unipolar to a multipolar world, and that trend is being accelerated by what's going on. And the one other thing I'll add to that mix, and I think this is honestly one of the things that could be one of the most negative pieces that come out of this, is our global trade system, where we were at the center of everything, is one of the reasons why the US dollar has been the reserve currency. And more specifically, it's why the cost or the interest rate that we could pay on our debt has been so low. Because the US Treasury or the US government bond has been historically one of the safest places to invest money. That trend appears to potentially be in transition at this point between the US government not getting their spending under control, and then also with more trade money going away from the US to other groups, partially because of this regional acceleration. There is a risk that we see a reduction in foreign interest in US government debt, that's a trend that's already started, but there's a risk that that trend accelerates even further. Now, to be intellectually fair, I don't think that will exclusively be because of trade, or maybe even a majority based on trade. I think our own fiscal situation is a big enough mess that could speak to what's caused it. But I do think that this will not help the situation. It's likely that this will hurt things further. The last thing, stock market implications. As many of you know, we've talked about for the last year and a half or so that US stock market valuations are at the third highest level on a cyclically and inflation adjusted basis, compared to where they've been over the last 150 years. And so the illustration we like to give clients is this. Right now, the stock market is like a campground where there's not been any rain for 2 years. The grass is brown, it's dry, it's crisp. The same thing is true of the leaves and the trees and the bushes. And right now, for the lack of a better term, Trump is out in the field shooting off fireworks. Does that mean we absolutely will have a fire? No, it doesn't. However, it does increase the likelihood of a fire starting. And because the field is already so crisp, because valuations are so high, the chances of that being a bigger hit and even causing a bear market increase substantially. So as a result of that, we really think that it's important to keep a close eye on things as they ultimately develop. And so with that, we'll go ahead and close things up and open it up to questions.
Just as a reminder, if you'd like to ask questions, just email me at bill@thefoxalliance.com. Okay, first question is, the calculation used to calculate the tariffs on Liberation Day incorporated the amount of the trade imbalance with each country without regard to items causing the trade imbalance. It also doesn't seem to address the relationship between the tariff percentage and the effect it will have on purchases of the items affected within the US. Max, could you handle that?
You bet. So, there's, I think when all this came out originally with the Liberation Day and the announcement there, it did seem a little foolish that we were calculating the amount of tariff based on the trade imbalance there. So, for example, if we are calculating the fact that, and by the way, let's back up and talk about what a trade imbalance is. A trade imbalance would be that we are importing more as a country than we are exporting to another country. That would be a trade deficit, where they're not buying as much from us as we're buying from them. And so Trump was saying, hey, this is a real problem. These other countries should be buying from us just as much as we're buying from them. We need to adjust these tariffs to meet that. Well, that seems kind of foolish with a country like, say, Vietnam. We have a massive consumption power, whereas Vietnam doesn't have nearly the same level of consumption capacity that we have. So there's no way that we're going to be buying the same amount from them that they're buying from us, and vice versa. So in that respect, that seems kind of crazy, and it was a kind of a widespread one-size-fits-all approach. Now, to be intellectually honest, which is what we like to do here, I also do think that that is kind of the only approach that could be widely applied, while seeking to address the other issues that we talked about earlier, with the concepts of legal concerns, lack of protection of law, those types of things. Maybe it's not the only one, but it is a way that they took to an approach that they took to address that. Because if you think about it, we're not going to change our rule of law in an effort to counter the fact that other countries don't have the rule of law in place. So how are we going to do that? I think Trump's approach was to raise tariffs to account for that. So hopefully in these negotiation processes, they go through the process of trying to address some of those other factors. And hopefully this was the kind of catalyst to make that happen. We'll see. But I would agree with whoever asked that question that I do think that it seemed a little foolish at the outset to approach it that way. They had to pick one way, and that was one way that they did. I think it was kind of silly, but again, there's other factors influencing this than just the actual amount of the tariff.
Well, thank you, Max. And those are all the questions that we have today. Thank you for our presenters, Josh, Max, and Laura. Have a great rest of the week, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Beyond the Noise webinar.